Merci beaucoup, Fanny Lopez, d'avoir en plus introduit la question, c'est vrai, peut-être un peu spécifique des large technical systems, des macrosystèmes techniques, qui, eux, pour s'organiser, donc c'est un concept de Thomas Hughes et qui a été repris en France par Alain Gras, anthropologue des techniques, qui a essayé de montrer comment est-ce qu'il y avait des dépendances territoriales qui se créent à partir de réseaux qui étaient souvent transnationaux. Et la question posée par ces nouvelles technologies, enfin les technologies de l'information et de la communication, c'est on peut dire l'éclatement du modèle du Large Technical System, sa recomposition par la relocalisation des systèmes production-consommation à des mailles plus fines. Et donc, je vous sais gré, Fanny Lopez, d'avoir mis en avant tous ces points-là, qui sont pour nous fondamentaux, dans la mesure où la question étant, est-ce que la ville intelligente continue de fonctionner avec ces réseaux traditionnels ou est-ce qu'elle les réorganise? On arrive là presque à l'idée qu'il pourrait les dissoudre et donc à ce qu'avec François on a appelé la possible disparition de la ville des réseaux, en tous les cas des réseaux traditionnels, avec une autonomie qui, si on la pense élargie à l'ensemble de la surface urbaine, pourrait construire des îlots qui seraient connectés au nom de solidarité qu'on ne connaît pas encore très très bien, et créant un espace complètement archipélagique. Si on poursuit l'hypothèse très loin, on arrive à ce modèle-là, à des villes avec des fonctionnements réticulaires qui sont cassés et des îlots de consommation et de production qui ne font plus jouer des mécanismes de solidarité. Donc voici ce que je voulais dire, parce que ça rapproche notre problématique de votre intervention en prenant un petit peu un scénario catastrophiste, effectivement, mais qui peut être pointé.
Où la solidarité se reconstitue à d'autres échelles aussi. C'est toute la question.
Voilà,
ouais.
C'est effectivement... peut-être, François, tu as quelque chose à dire là-dessus ou...
Non, j'allais ajouter ce que vient de dire Fanny, c'est-à-dire qu'on peut imaginer d'autres configurations où la solidarité n'est plus assurée par le large technical system, mais par d'autres mécanismes du proche. Le problème, c'est que ces solidarités du proche, elles s'inscrivent dans d'autres hiérarchisations, d'autres dénivellations spatiales qu'il faut identifier, qu'il faut nommer. Mais je pense qu'on en reparlera tout à l'heure avec l'intervention de Samuel Marvin. En tout cas, pour l'instant, on peut peut-être commencer à discuter sur cette première intervention.
Je vais faire deux remarques, Marc Jaouen du PUCA. La première, c'est que historiquement, ce que vous avez décrit, c'est-à-dire l'apparition de la mise autonome, etc., de ces réflexions sur l'autonomie, est absolument en France, en tous les cas, contemporain de la montée en puissance du nucléaire. Donc il y avait cette dimension-là qui était très importante. La deuxième, c'est vous n'avez jamais évoqué ce que dans les services on connaît bien, qui est en termes de mode de calcul de l'impact énergétique des kilowatts, c'est le fait que quand on fait appel à de l'électricité provenant du réseau électrique, donc, et entre autres donc, à 80% des centrales nucléaires, on multiplie par 2,58 le coefficient. Enfin, il y a un coefficient qui s'applique qui est de 2,58 et qui est lié à l'éloignement, en fait. Simplement, transporter de l'électricité, ça consomme de l'électricité. Donc, c'est tout. C'était ce point-ci qui est important parce qu'effectivement, ça peut rentrer en ligne de compte dans les stratégies de relocalisation de la production à un niveau local.
Juste sur le caractère contemporain du rêve de déconnexion et de l'émergence du nucléaire français, on peut aussi revenir là-dessus sur ces rapports de coexistence ou de consécution, sur le fait que, je crois que c'est Simondon qui le rappelle, que dans le mode d'existence des objets techniques, il y a à un moment donné l'actualisation d'un certain nombre de connaissances techniques qui viennent s'inscrire dans les objets techniques qui font notre quotidien. Et à ce titre-là, il pointe le caractère, en quelque sorte, enfin, de la parenté, on va dire, entre les technologies du nucléaire et celles du photovoltaïque qui empruntent à une même physique. Voilà, ça n'apporte pas grand-chose à la discussion, si ce n'est qu'effectivement, il n'y a pas forcément des rapports d'étapes qui se jouent sur l'ensemble de la chaîne de production d'un système énergétique à un moment donné.
D'ailleurs, aujourd'hui, il y a aussi des recherches sur le nucléaire durable, enfin, même si ça reste...
Bien, s'il n'y a pas d'autres questions à ce stade, on va enchaîner avec Simon Marvin.
Peut-être un petit mot juste avant de la présentation de Simon Marvin portera entre autres sur les Urban Operating Systems, qui sont donc ces centres qui récollectent les informations urbaines et qui recomposeraient le fonctionnement des réseaux traditionnels. Voici, maintenant, je vais laisser la parole à Simon Marvin. Voilà.
Thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak to you this afternoon. I'll just let people put on the headphones if anybody needs them. I apologise, I can't do my presentation to you in French, so I'll speak in English slowly. I'm going to try and connect the presentation to a number of the themes that were emerging this morning and in the last presentation. I was particularly struck by, from this morning's presentation, the question of, is the smart city new? Or is it a very older set of ideas about the city? And if there is something new about it, what is it? And I realised when I was listening this morning and to this afternoon's presentation, I've been grappling with those ideas, really trying to understand why are we excited or worried about the smart city, and what difference might it make to the future of urbanism. So I want to do, this is a talk on a much bigger project with a colleague of mine. We've been trying to do some new empirical work on the rollout of different aspects of smart cities. And we've been doing field work in a wide range of different contexts, looking at particular emblematic examples of smart ecosystems, the operating systems, the software systems that underpin these technologies, this new trend around municipal data platforms. We've been interested in the question of the standardization of smart cities, turning the smart city into a mobile product that can move between different contexts. Questions around civic hacking and infrastructures of resistance, the use of smart by social movements and civic society. And we've done work on urban operating centres, and in particular the control room in Rio de Janeiro. So the broader project is really trying to excavate the sort of practices and politics of smart in a number of different contexts, focusing on particular entry points. And today I'm going to talk about these things called urban operating systems. If you were to buy a smart city, you'd need, in theory, to buy an operating system. It's a piece of software and hardware, a set of hardware, different forms of hardware, sensors, data analytics, computers. And I want to talk a little bit about where do these operating systems come from? Are these new products, or are they old products that have been reinvented for the urban market? Now, this question of whether this is new, whether this smart discourse and debate is new, it clearly isn't particularly new. There's a really nice book by a historian of science and technology in the city called Jennifer Light. The book's called From Warfare to Welfare. And she really nicely charts the way in which many of the technologies that were developed in the context of the military and space programs in the 50s and 60s were actually trialed and tested in many North American cities in the late 60s and early 1970s. So in the economic downturn of the early 70s and reductions in military and space expenditure, many of the technologies, the software and hardware systems that have been developed for military space control, data analysis, a lot of the early computing capacity, corporations were funded by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development to test those very same technologies in New York, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia. And this book is a really nice case of the failed attempt to turn many of those technologies that were developed in those military space programs into tools for addressing the urban crisis in America. And it's a fantastic hidden story, and it amazes me that that story is, to some extent, remains hidden with this turn to the smart city, that we've tried this before. This was tried before in a systematic way with state sponsorship, a large amount of resources and funding in partnership with local government. And it's a really sad history of the failure to try to incorporate these techniques and technologies into the complex domain of the city. Now, what was interesting after this failure was that the technology sector looked elsewhere to develop these systems. And there's some really fascinating work on the sort of critical history of the development of information technologies in the corporate sector. This is a really nice book by Kalininkos, Governing Through Technology, which is an analysis of how corporate information systems have really how they've reshaped the way in which private corporations work. What's interesting about this storyline is that with the failed attempt to introduce these sorts of technologies into the urban sector, the IT sector refocused around providing corporate IT solutions. And one of the critical ideas in that was this set of software products called Enterprise Resource Planning, ERP systems. And what the IT sector was very interested in was how you could functionally integrate the disconnected corporate entity together. So the techniques, technologies and practices that were developed in the 60s and 70s were turned towards the corporate sector. IT became a really important part, in fact the biggest part of capital expenditure in the US. And forms of software, these integrated software products, standardized the ways in which corporations understood data and information, its exchangeability and transferability. And in a sense, these information products established a particular type of regulative regime within the corporate entity. And this sort of body of work shows that how the corporate, in a sense, the corporate sector had to sort of submit itself to the standardized discipline of these particular sorts of software products. Now, why does this matter to the city? Well, we're in another period, of which there's been many, in which we've rediscovered the importance of technology in the city, and particularly smart technologies. Now, what we argue in this paper is that we can look at these technologies, these software systems, these operating systems, as forms of abstract machines or piloting devices. The software and the representations of the software shape the relationship, they shape conduct, They structure the compositions of data and decision-making into particular sorts of serialized, sequential forms of decision-making. And I think we conceptualize the operating system and the representation of the operating system in a sense as operative rationales. So the operative rationale of the software system becomes quite critical in projecting an understanding, a truth of the city. And I want to show you through a review of these operating systems, in a sense, how they embody assumptions about how the city should work. So these operating systems, they're integrated information packages targeted at the urban market. If you look at any software company at the moment, they usually have an urban operating system product. The illustration on the right-hand side is from IBM's Intelligent Operations Manual. That's a manual produced for the users of their operating system. We looked at operating systems produced by IBM, Hitachi, Microsoft, Cisco, Robotica, and Planet IT. There is many other systems as well. And we interviewed software developers, and we looked really carefully at the training programs, the publicity and promotional material about how these companies represent their product, how they seek to implement it in different contexts. And what's emerged out of that is 5 ways across the whole sector in which they envision the problematic of the smart city and its solution. So what I want to just briefly take you through is, if you look through the lenses of these operating systems, what sort of city is produced through what type of processes, and what's the logic of control that's assumed from within inside these pieces of these software, looking through the lenses of these 5 steps that are commonly used by all the companies to represent the problem, the solution, and the outcome. Just to give you some sense of where the argument's going, this is a quote from that Red Book from IBM. And you can notice in the first paragraph the way that the city is seen as a problem. The problem of today's city is it's based on separate domains with no real ability to be managed as an entire entity. So you have this sense of the fragmented city that is unable to be managed, is too complex, is out of control. City managers have no central place to get real-time status or historical reports. Older systems are domain-specific, not concerned with the consequences in other domains. So this notion of the problematic notion of the separation of different systems. But daily operation of cities generate vast amounts of data from many different sources. But cities often lack the ability to visualize and extract meaningful information. Now, it's no accident that IBM see the city in that way, or many other ICT software companies see the city in that way. Because if you go to the next paragraph, the IBM Integrated Operations Center addresses these and many other challenging issues by providing insight, management, and oversight capabilities for any city or enterprise, as they both face many of the same issues. And I think this starts to tell you something about where does this software come from when the nature of the urban problem of the city is also seen as the same sort of problem that a corporate enterprise would have in integrating its operations. So, what's the vision that's being created? What is the promise of the smart city? And every software company uses a diagram like this. in a sense, it shows different elements of the city, infrastructures, environments, sectors, different sets of social interests, and it presents a vision of them interconnected together as a system of systems. And if you look at any offer from any of the software companies, you will find a diagram like this right at the start of the analysis. This is the vision about what could be created through the entry point of a smart cities system. So the argument is that it's possible to link together what currently is disconnected. And if you talk to the software sector about why do they show the city like this, it's because this is very similar to the sorts of vision that they portrayed to the corporate sector. You could connect up logistics, you could connect up production, human resources, you could connect up different aspects of the corporate enterprise. And this sort of diagram is very resonant of that sort of vision of how you can connect an entity together. The next step, though, is a bit more problematic. The second step, if you, I suppose, what's the process through which you forge the interconnections between the disconnected? This is actually an illustration from some of the sort of the training materials. This is the sort of first level homogenizing diagram. There's many other diagrams that sit behind this. And again, all of the companies use these sorts of homogeneous layering diagrams. If you want an urban operating system, you have to configure your existing infrastructure, data sources, modes of organization into a series of layers and boxes, discrete entities, so that you can match the organization, the data of the city to the assumptions that are built into the software system. So what you have to imagine here is that these software systems are very much modeled on the modern corporate enterprise. And what they're attempting to do is to see the city through the lens of a modern corporate enterprise, which is broken down into a series of discrete entities and steps and boxes. So as soon as you enter into an engagement with the operating system, you're required to configure your own decision-making data according to the prerequisites of the software, which this diagram starts to try to capture some of the complexity that's involved in that form of implementation. So again, very, very common way of seeing the city. The sector often gave us an example of the problems they have in trying to implement these sorts of ways of engaging with the urban context. They bemoan the fact that urban ecologists can have a standardized way of understanding the city through natural ecology, and they're really disappointed that there can't be a standardized way of seeing the social, economic and technological dimensions of urban life. The third step is assembling an ecosystem. And usually this entails the particular software product being at the center of the ecosystem. So this is an example again from IBM with their Intelligent Operating Center. City governance policy is sort of external to this at the top of the diagram. And the argument is that you can create this all-encompassing ecosystem mediated through the software and the operating system that's able to relate to visualization, dashboards, alerts, reports, analysis, forms of analytics, predictive systems and modeling, city archives, and that can relate to control of infrastructures, traffic, water, public security, forms of data integration. The argument is that it's possible to reassemble the homogenized layers through the entry point of the Intelligent Operating Center and integrate that with a wider ecosystem that provides the connections between what's currently disconnected. Again, a very standard diagram. I could show you 4 or 5 other examples of the same typology of diagram and the same claims that are made about the connections that can be formed. The 4th step is the closed loop. And I think this relates actually to some of the ideas that were discussed in the last presentation about autarky and autonomy. The way these software systems are designed is that they draw on a standardized set of data. And as that the antecedents, the history of that, are the ways in which these enterprise resource planning software products would utilize a standardized set of corporate accounts. So a company's formal accounting system would hopefully mesh onto the enterprise resource planning software. And a lot of effort has been put into trying to standardize corporate accounts to match the prerequisites of these software systems. Now, I think what's important about this diagram, and they use this one a lot, this is a very common diagram, and when you talk about its antecedents, they talk about the fact this is based on analysing a standard set of accounts from a corporate entity. I think what's interesting about this is you can see the way in which it's an enclosed loop. Data, analytics, insights, and action are all derived in theory from a standardized set of data. So in terms of decision making, it creates, it's part of this wider ecosystem which has very clear boundaries about what's inside and what's outside in terms of the sort of forms of knowledge and expertise that can be incorporated into the smart city system. So this tells us something about the nature of the boundary making that's starting to be done by the work of these systems. And the final step is, what does this produce? There's a fantastic document that Hitachi, as part of their smart city products, has produced. And the language of this diagram, disassembling and reassembling urban circulations, is actually taken from Hitachi's own document. They talk about the disassembly of the city, which is characterized by the second diagram, where you reduce the city into a set of homogenized, standardized layers. And they talk about the way in which the capability of the software, the ecosystem, allows you to selectively reassemble data, technology, particular sorts of social interests, particular scales, and levels of action together into solutions. The sorts of solutions they illustrate this with, and I really recommend having a look at this document, is solutions like energy demand-side management, how you can extract districts and parts of the city from the overall network because they're under pressure and require demand-side management responses. It's very much around a process of a much more technically data-driven form of disassembly and selective reassembly of different sorts of urban circulations. And I think this sort of captures quite nicely some of the capacities that are developed by these software systems in terms of their ability to further segment and divide infrastructures, resources, particular sets of social interests, and space. So just by way of conclusion then, I suppose this isn't new. I think you can make an argument, which we make in this paper, that this is not a new process the sort of the logic of the smart cities. It's part of a much broader logic about the role of software and operating systems that have been developed in other contexts, particularly well exploited in a very congested corporate market, and are now being shifted onto the urban market. And the problem with this, and this really comes across very nicely in the critical work that's been done on the corporate application of these systems, is this: the code that underpins these systems is largely closed. The logic and the presumptions and assumptions and conditions of its production are very difficult to question when they're produced in one context and moved into another. And it's very hard for strategic priorities and other forms of knowledge that are seen as being outside of the system to be included in the logic. So strategic priorities tend to be subordinated to the logic of control contained in the software. That's the reason that's a problem, is because the software requires a high degree of functional simplification in order to be operated. And transactional mechanics become critical, rather than human agency and decision making, really become the focus of attention. So when you look at the corporate experience of trying to implement these software systems, there's a big emphasis on simplification, transactional mechanics, to produce these sort of claimed interconnections, and it generates a very strong internal focus on the corporate entity and about it being able to develop predictable and controllable relations. There's a lot of very nice evidence about how this reduces the flexibility and adaptability of corporate enterprises as they become focused on questions around predictable and controllable relations. So I think the argument, the third point then, is there's something, the reason that smart cities matter is because I think the operational rationalities developed in corporate enterprises are being transmuted, transferred into urban contexts. So this whole issue around the re-engineering of the city, its dis and reassembly, questions of modularity, efficiency, continuity, security, a whole set of rationalities developed in other sectors, particularly the corporate sector, increasingly are being applied in an urban context. In some sense, they see the city as being like a sort of flexible, responsive, logistical enterprise that's managed and ordered through the rationality of these operating systems. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Simon Marvin, for this very clear presentation of the UOS. We had an example of it this morning. I think you would agree. This morning, Alain Cagouat presented us the CMS, Community Management System, which is a kind of UOS, like you are explaining it to us. How do you analyze the CMS of? Yeah, you were there for Alain Cagouat. It was a kind of prototype of a global UOS. It was a kind of a little UOS.
I only heard the last part of Alain's presentation. Is he here? Is he still here?
No, he left.
I can talk about him there. No, it was a very, very interesting presentation, and Alain's response to the questions were very, very interesting. There was three things from his talk that I thought were that interested me. The first one was the way in which I think one of the logics of these operating systems is a particular scale of rebundling, and the initiative that Alain talked about, I think, struck me as being very similar to some of the arguments I'd seen Hitachi make about reassembling at sort of local district sort of scale responses. And it struck me, there was not that I know the Toshiba system or the Japanese Nedo's interests in this area, but it struck me there was potentially some similarities between the logic, the operational logic embodied in the system he was talking about and some of these other systems. The other dimension that struck me that he talked about very openly was the way in which the capacity, this system created a capacity, but it wasn't clear what its purpose was. And I'm very struck by the way in which it's very difficult to argue against this smart cities logic. And the logic itself almost doesn't need to have a justification of what its purpose is. And I was really struck by the symbolic importance of the scheme in the urban politics of its implementation. Yet there wasn't a clear sense of what material work was this system going to actually, what difference would it make? And it seemed to be about a set of potentials. I think the third dimension that was very interesting is this transnational form of experimentation in which the Japanese state funded a smart cities project in sort of provincial France. So I think there's some very interesting questions about this logic and its apparent mobility, the mobility of the smart cities discourse to move between different contexts. And what does it mean for a site? What does it mean for a French city to be a site of experimentation in a bigger Japanese state project around the potential of the smart city?
Je tenais à rappeler aussi une chose, avant de poser une autre question à Simon Marvin, c'est qu'il était l'auteur, donc je disais, de Splintering Urbanism, et cet ouvrage avait l'immense avantage de présenter, on pourrait dire, une opposition entre ce qu'ils appelaient les premium spaces, donc c'était les espaces où un service particulier était rendu aux personnes qui utilisaient un type de réseau spécifique, réservé à un type de population qui était, on pourrait dire, richement doté, et l'effondrement de l'idéal de service public universel avec la fin du Large Technical System. Je ne reviendrai pas sur le détail de cette argumentation, mais il y avait dans cet ouvrage Splintering Urbanism l'opposition potentielle entre deux formes de services publics qui étaient liées à la privatisation progressive des services publics urbains en réseau. Et donc ça, c'était pour le contexte. And I would like to ask you, Simon Marvin, how do you analyze, with the splintering urbanism thesis, what is happening in the smart city? Is there a continuation of the creation of new premium spaces, or how this social segregation is going on now with this new technological background?
I think there's a number of tendencies that a number of tendencies that are being developed. Overall, I would argue that this represents the sort of smart city, the capacity and capability of the smart cities, systems, the social interests that tend to be predominantly involved in them, potentially mean there's an acceleration of forms of fragmentation and splintering. But the processes through which that will develop, I think, aren't quite clear yet. So the claim, I suppose, is that some of the rationality of the corporate enterprise is being applied to the urban context, yet actually there's multiple corporate rationalities. So I think the interesting thinking about the different contexts that we've been doing work, you can start to see the exemplification of different logics, different types of corporate rationality. So in some cases, so we've done quite a lot of work on the control room in Rio de Janeiro, which is one of the emblematic examples of a smart system. And when you look in detail at that city and the origins of the system, it's a sort of cross between it's very similar. The sorts of people who work in the control room are recruited from airlines, people who work in airline logistical systems, freight distribution systems. So it requires people who have a good understanding of logistical software systems. They also recruit people from control rooms of large shopping centres, large retail, large sporting complexes, who have a good understanding of utilising control systems for security control. So the Rio system is a really unusual mix of logistical and security control logics applied to a set of urban infrastructures. So in that context, the logic is very much around how does the control room maintain urban circulation under difficult political, technological or ecological challenges. So it's very much the logic of a sort of if you look at the control room that Air France use, has some very remarkable similarities with the control room in Rio de Janeiro, or the control room that NASA uses to control a space flight. They share some of the same software systems. They share some of the same antecedents. So I think that's that is a strongly logistical logic. I think when you look at some of the other logics, like some of these municipal data platforms that we've been looking at in the US, London, it's more like the logic of Facebook and Twitter. How can you utilize urban data as a commercial or economic resource? I think there's something slightly different going on there. It's about trying to see the way in which those sorts of corporate enterprises utilize user data as mobilize it as an economic resource. I think similar sorts of processes are going on in some of the examples we've been looking at. So New York as a city was very much influenced by Bloomberg and Bloomberg's own analytics background. They recruit people who come from a background in the sort of US social media sector to help develop New York's municipal data response. So I think that's a different logic, a different corporate logic that's at work. And I think there's another one which is probably around how to sweat assets more effectively, a sort of a sort of logic that's about how corporates can really understand the differential costs of different parts of their services. And I wonder if those sorts of logics are being applied to rationalize urban services under conditions of austerity. But that's still a question. I haven't found particularly good examples of that yet. But yeah, so I think there's some quite subtle logics that will work on the city, potentially producing quite different modes of control, and we're still trying to work out what they are.
Thanks a lot for this answer. Et je poserai une dernière question et après je vous promets je vous laisse la parole. Je vais encore une fois contextualiser. Evgeny Morozov a fait paraître un livre qui s'appelle To Save Everything Click Here, dans lequel il présente les technologies de l'information et de la communication sont poussées en avant par les industriels au titre des solutions qu'elles apportent. Et Evgeny Morozov renverse le problème en disant que ce ne sont pas des questions qui sont posées et des réponses qui sont apportées par ces technologies, mais c'est ces technologies qui se présentent comme des réponses, et tous les systèmes de pilotage qu'on est en train de mettre en place, en fait, reconfigurent toutes les questions à l'aune des réponses déjà prêtes qu'elles proposent. Et donc, dans la présentation que vous avez donnée des Urban Operating Systems, je voulais savoir dans quelle mesure on pouvait intégrer la remarque de Morozov et ce qu'il appelle le solutionnisme, c'est-à-dire il y aurait une solution pour tout, et les systèmes urbains, à l'aune de ce critère-là, seraient des systèmes solutionnables, c'est-à-dire que pour la question des transports, on aurait un ensemble de solutions données qui permettraient de résoudre à la fois la congestion, à la fois la question de l'empreinte environnementale des gaz à effet de serre et ce genre de choses. Et dans quelle mesure ce paradigme décisionnaire et technocratique porté par les technologies de l'information et de la communication répond effectivement à cette idéologie du solutionnisme dans les Urban Operating Systems. Si c'est clair. Je vais pas poser en anglais. Yes. Yeah. The question is the rise of solutionism in the urban operating system. Is it applying now, this solutionism?
Yep, okay.
Or is it a new way of governing cities? We already have the solution, but we have no questions, in fact, with this ICT. We say we can pilot everything, and so there is a new rationality coming, and so the US represent ideologically this kind of...
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think there's a much longer history of attempts to take corporate private sector principles of governance into local and urban governments. So I think this is an acceleration of a much longer standing and older logic. So there's a sort of there's a history, particularly in a sort of, I suppose, US, UK, and other contexts, of attempts to apply principles and concepts and regimes of control from the private sector into the public sector. So I think partly there's that logic to understand and build upon, and to try to work through what happens when the informational systems themselves are transferred. The other issue, of course, is what happens when you try to implement this software in an urban context. And the vision that's presented by the software companies comes under some pressure. And there's some quite interesting views about, I mean, if you look at the literature on the implementation of these integrated information packages in corporates, they talk about electronic concrete, the way in which the assumptions of the software configure the organization of the corporate entity. And there's a lovely example of a piece of software, I think produced by a French software company. It was bought by a Nordic energy company, and in order for the software to work, they had to create an entity, a division in Paris. Else otherwise, the piece of software couldn't deal with the multiple transactions between different parts of the entity. And there's quite an interesting debate in the sort of critical corporate informatics sector. One argument is the presumptions of the software get challenged through its implementation. So one argument is the software has to become more flexible to deal with the complexities of its implementation. The other argument is no, that's not what happens, is that the context has to configure itself to fit the presumptions of the electronic concrete. And it's there's some really interesting, I think, further research questions there. One of the companies that we've interviewed has had to try to substantially loosen the steps, the sort of transactional decision-making in its control system, given some of its experience in an urban context, has had to try to open the software. And that's where there's this interesting debate. Is it really open or not? many of the companies have found it difficult to institutionally and organizationally and culturally to get the type of buy-in from the multiplicity of partners who would have to be engaged in these forms of integrated software in an urban context. So some of these products have shifted from an urban focus to a focus on, for example, large sports stadia, large retail complexes, parks, national parks. So there's been a sort of shift where they're looking for contexts that are organisationally and politically more simple for the implementation of the software. I think the third point in response to that is, are there alternatives to these sorts of systems? So some of the arguments are interest in open source software, urban operating systems, the role of user-led responses through developing apps or community or civic society control and experimentation with the software. Although I think one of the issues with that is that it's still utilising the same software systems that are underpinned by similar sorts of organisational rationalities. So even the alternatives, it's difficult to know what's alternative when they're based on the same technological antecedents.
On peut peut-être vous laisser la parole là maintenant.
Thank you very much. J'ai beaucoup aimé votre... Je continue en français parce que je suis pas bon en anglais. I'm not very fluent in English. I'm going on in French. J'ai bien aimé votre présentation avec finalement la montée en puissance de la logique. Et ça m'a fait penser au jeu d'échecs où finalement, quand on joue aux échecs, celui qui gagne les échecs, c'est celui qui a la meilleure logique. Mais il y a une ouverture aux échecs qui s'appelle l'ouverture panique, H2, H4. Et en France, on a vécu cette ouverture panique la semaine dernière, il y a 15 jours. Et face à la logique, il y a des gens qui ne rentrent pas dans la logique de tout le monde et qui bouleversent complètement le système urbain. Et donc, je me demande si on est vraiment rentré dans un monde de logique et si, comme le disait Ulrich Beck, qui est décédé il y a un mois maintenant, on n'est pas rentré dans la société du risque, où en fait on a un risque à un moment où tout le monde attend des certitudes, on a un risque qu'on n'est pas capable d'apprécier et surtout de comment y répondre.
I think that's a really good point, because I begin to ask myself, are these sorts of responses and the claims that they make, are they about an illusion of control? Is this really, given that it's not very clear what they're supposed to do? What is it that they provide that we don't currently have? Is it really about a form of security that they present to us? They present to us the illusion that we can control the uncontrollable. I think back to some of the work that we did in Rio de Janeiro, which is a really difficult urban context. Socially, politically, it has really challenging ecological conditions particularly around heavy rainfall and flooding. And the irony of their control system is that nothing really changes. The city, the emphasis of because if it's a sort of logistical emphasis, the control room provides them with the capacity to deal with the sort of short-term response to crisis in quite innovative, well, quite successful ways. It enables them to maintain urban flows and circulation and the illusion that everyday life is continuing. But it actually does nothing to address any of the underlying problems that the city has. It's very much around how does the city deal with the short-term, the immediate crisis and response. It creates an illusion of control. The news media report from the control room every day. There's media based there all the time. The local authority and the mayor utilise the control room for making announcements about municipal politics and policy changes. And sometimes I wonder, is this an illusion of control in the context of the uncontrollable? So I don't have a simple answer to your question, but I like the question.
Je pose aussi la question en français. Je me pose la question de savoir s'il n'y a pas aussi une question de culture, parce que je fais partie d'un groupe de normalisation sur les infrastructures urbaines intelligentes. Et donc, c'est assez intéressant parce que c'est les Japonais qui ont souhaité que soit créé ce groupe et qui ont pris le leadership en fait de ce groupe. Quand je dis les Japonais, c'est Hitachi, Toshiba, c'est-à-dire c'est des entreprises japonaises. Et en fait, donc dans les réunions qui ont lieu, participent différents pays. Et il y a vraiment des cultures très différentes qui s'affrontent, avec d'une part certains qui ont une vision assez cartésienne de la ville et qui veulent justement tout contrôler, tout mettre en fait, tout numériser et qui pensent que finalement ça va régler tous les problèmes, si je puis dire. Et puis d'autres pays qui ont d'autres cultures en fait différentes et qui eux sont justement pour laisser plus de place à l'inattendu, à ce qui n'est pas justement numérisable, si je puis dire. Et donc je me pose la question de savoir s'il n'y a pas un facteur aussi culturel en fait qui joue par rapport à ça.
I think that the question of standards and the standardization of smart cities is really quite fascinating. That's an area we're going to be doing some work in. And you're quite right, there's a big debate going on about standards for smart cities. The British government and its Standards Institute has made a lot of progress. Yeah. I mean, there is a standard you can have a look at for smart cities in the UK. I mean, it's quite a remarkable document in the sense that it's, I don't think there's any other, I might be wrong, but I don't think there's any national or international standards for the future development of cities in quite the way that there is standardization processes for smart cities. And part of the logic and driver for these processes are that problem of the requirements of the software systems needing a standardized set of inputs and data into them. So the standardized process has been, as the UK government sees smart city technologies as a potential export opportunity, and it's worked closely with the software and hardware sector to try to start shaping standards, because there's a process in the software sector called gentrification. It's not the sort of urban gentrification. They refer to gentrification as a process whereby software products can be totally mobile. The idea is that the product should be able to be sold in almost any market without requiring substantial amounts of customization. So the smart cities standards debate is really quite significant. It's happening in Japan, America, and Europe. And of course, everyone's trying to compete to sort of shape the nature of those standards. And there is some quite interesting, we haven't done a lot of work on this, I should say, but there was some really interesting, some of the sort of debates we've been following. The German cities are really opposed to standardization of smart technologies. Yeah, and France do excellent. You better get in and stop it. Yeah. I mean, there is, it's an area. I mean, what we think's trying to what we think this is about is, again, it's about trying to create some of the reason that the software sector is so interested in the potential of the cities market is the corporate market is saturated. These very expensive integrated systems, they can't sell. There's nowhere else to sell them, so the urban market is very much a target for them. And the process of standardization is about trying to make the context more amenable for the sale of these systems. So I think it raises some really quite interesting issues. But we haven't done a lot of work on that yet, but it's our next case. Yep. Yep. Yeah. And the other interesting about the UK context is the smart cities policy response by national government is led by business and industry department, not the traditional urban and regional development department. It's a business constituted agenda. Thank you.
Moi, j'ai juste une question rapide pour les deux présentations. Je vais parler en français. Est-ce que vous pouvez dire un peu plus sur la manière dont les exemples ou les prototypes ou les politiques ou les stratégies ou les systèmes, les urban operating systems ou tout ça, comment ça se voyage à travers le monde, comment ça se mobilise, comment ça se transfère d'un contexte à un autre. Donc on peut imaginer qu'il y a différentes personnes à l'intérieur de IBM qui se parlent, qui travaillent. Et on sait très bien parce qu'on va chacun dans des colloques urbains et il y a un mec de IBM ou de Cisco qui voyage dans les avions. Et donc ça, c'est un moyen de transfert de politique ou d'exemple ou de prototype. Mais est-ce que vous avez d'autres éléments sur la manière dont ça voyage? Ça fait référence à toute la littérature actuelle en études urbaines sur le policy mobility et les processus là-dessus.
I think IBM's a good example. IBM has an urban laboratory in Dublin, so you can go and visit and see these software products simulated. They use simulated or actual examples of their use. IBM in Dublin, with its laboratory in Dublin, which is there, I think, for tax reasons primarily, also has quite close working relationships with Dublin Corporation. So there's a sort of sense in which it's partly a test bed for the mutual development of its software products. The companies themselves, I know a little bit about. I've spent a little bit of time with IBM, and I think what I'm saying about IBM is in the public domain anyway. They have the companies themselves are organised into sort of strongly research and development teams and strongly sales-led teams. So you have the R&D function in the laboratory, they forge relationships with cities that they want to do experiments with. They sometimes fund those experiments, or they sometimes have competitions that cities can apply for funding for. And the sales teams who are selling these products, these are the people who are flying around between cities. The way they tend to do it is that they have existing relationships that they build upon. So the sales teams will often have existing relationships with information officers in local government or public entities. And the potentials of these smart systems will be put on the table as part of wider discussions and debates that they're having about the future sale of standard IT products. So they tend to look for contexts that they might be able to do some form of demonstration and experimentation with. They internally, they're very concerned. Most of the companies, I think privately, are really concerned about whether this urban market really exists in reality. They've found it very hard to sell a single product, a single operating system. They claim they have, but actually when you look behind it, they often haven't. Their operating system is often one of a number of different systems that are, but in terms of their promotion of the sale of the system, so there's something going on here where it's many of the cities are very uncomfortable about having one relationship with one vendor, with one software provider. So again, the reality of translating this into action is actually quite messy and difficult for them. But if you look across the companies, they use a range of techniques. You'll see they sponsor, they have competitions where cities compete to work with the software companies. They second staff. They use a variety of different types of techniques to build the urban market for this sort of product.
Sur la question des transferts, moi je ne sais pas trop ce que je peux dire. Pour en tout cas, c'est les protagonistes de cette décennie 70-80 sur lesquels j'ai le plus travaillé. Plusieurs choses. Il y a un fort désir de transfert des technologies spatiales, qui s'inscrit dans tout le rêve aussi futuriste de la période. Le casque de l'astronaute fait la une de la revue d'Architectural Design en 1967. Donc les architectes essaient de capter les inventions énergétiques qui se passent notamment dans ce domaine-là essentiellement. Ensuite, les échanges entre les projets, c'est les revues d'architecture, un ou deux colloques. Il y a un colloque sur l'autonomie à Genève en 1978, les publications et quelques ouvrages, mais peu, parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'ouvrages de vulgarisation technique à l'époque. Les prototypes ne sont pas construits, c'est beaucoup de projets fictionnels, c'est quand même très à la marge des préoccupations du monde aussi de l'architecture. Dans les revues, ça reste assez marginal. Il y a deux ouvrages peut-être qui se distinguent. Il y en a un qui s'appelle Energy Building en 1974 de Philip Stedman, qui travaille à Cambridge, qui fait un peu le point entre toutes les expérimentations, qui est plutôt scientifique. Et un autre qui s'appelle Radical Technologies, mais qui est plus une revue. Mais voilà, c'est tout ce que je peux dire un peu
là-dessus. Moi aussi, j'ai posé ma question en français, d'abord à Simon Marvin, et puis ensuite à Fanny. Simon, j'avais une petite objection à vous faire suite à votre intervention. Moi, j'ai trouvé extrêmement convaincante dans ce que vous décrivez de l'importation, en quelque sorte, d'une rationalité d'entreprise au sein de l'action publique à travers des logiciels, à travers des systèmes d'exploitation qui reposent sur une théorie de l'action qui vient du monde de l'entreprise. Mais d'une part, cette rationalité entrepreneuriale dans le monde de l'action publique, elle n'est peut-être pas nouvelle, elle préexiste avec le New Public Management. En France, le projet d'entreprise dans les mairies, préfacé par Jean-Paul Huchon, ça date de la fin des années 80. Et d'une certaine manière, effectivement, ça peut être pernicieux parce que cette fois-ci, c'est invisible, c'est dans le cœur même des systèmes d'exploitation, à l'opposé d'ailleurs de la nouvelle visibilité des centres de production d'énergie dont parlait Fanny Lopez. Il me semble que là où il y a peut-être quelque chose qui se joue, il me semble que, enfin vous l'avez évoqué, mais très peu, et j'aimerais que vous reveniez là-dessus, c'est sur le fait que ça bouleverse pas simplement l'action publique, mais plutôt la relation de l'action publique avec les grandes entreprises concessionnaires ou délégataires de services publics urbains en réseau, qui sont des entreprises, mais qui ne s'inscrivaient peut-être pas dans la rationalité, dans l'optimisation telle qu'elle est conçue par le génie logiciel et cette offre de nouvelles entreprises sur le secteur. Donc, ce n'est pas simplement le monde de l'action publique qui en serait bouleversé, mais un système complexe de relations entre le monde des collectivités et le monde des entreprises, des services urbains en réseau, avec peut-être de nouveaux acteurs gagnants. On ne sait pas, vous dites vous-même que ces entreprises ont du mal à commercialiser ces logiciels-là, mais finalement, est-ce que l'impact n'est pas plus complexe qu'une opposition binaire, rationalité de l'entreprise, rationalité de l'action publique?
Yes, it is more complex. I think if you look back at the new public management of the 80s and 90s, I think I said in response to an earlier question, I think you can identify a longer-term history to these dynamics. I think during some of those debates, though, certainly, I suppose, I'm thinking in terms of some of the UK debates, there was a stronger sense that this was a debate about the transference of private sector techniques into the public sector. What concerns me about the smart cities debate is there isn't a debate about what this is really about. So, you know, if we were having a debate about could you turn the city into a corporate entity, then I think the politics of this would be at least exposed. I think what concerns me is the hidden nature of the way in which these sorts of rationalities are being sort of trying to be inserted or transmuted into an urban context. There isn't a dialogue or discussion about that, from what I can see. Maybe there is. There's more of a debate around the formal privatisation of public services in the UK, but there isn't a wider debate about the development of these sorts of analytical techniques, their desirability. What particular problems do they solve and who for? I can't see that debate taking place. I can't see very much critical questioning of whether or not this type of response, what is it? How does it make sense? What problematic do we solve by investing in these sorts of smart systems? That's what I can't see happening. That's what I'm primarily concerned about. And I'll accept that I have portrayed the storyline in quite a stark way. I think in the questioning I've tried to play out some more of the subtleties and problems for the corporate sector, but I still think the underlying logic of what is being attempted is deeply problematic, is hidden, and isn't subject to wider debate or scrutiny.
Alors, s'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, on va passer la parole à Gabriel Dupuis, grand témoin de cette séance sur les réseaux.